Evening and welcome to the Tuesday, June 11th meeting of the RTD Finance and Planning Committee. The committee will now come to order. We are convened as of 5:30 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. My name is Doug Tisdale, and I have the honor of serving as the chairman of the Finance and Planning Committee. I would respectfully ask everyone who is attending this meeting, please mute yourself unless you are recognized to speak. That will make for a much better record. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And please note that the committee meetings of the RTD Board of Directors will continue for a time to be held remotely via Zoom, and they will be audio and video recorded. The meeting recordings, along with the unofficial minutes of these meetings, will be posted as soon as practicable on the RTD Board's website. During today's meeting, we are also providing to you communication access real-time translation, also known as CART. Anyone who would like to access this service should send an email to the RTD board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com, and a link will be provided to you. Additionally, the CART transcript can be automatically translated into Spanish for anyone who would like to have access to a live transcript of this meeting in Spanish. And finally, a live stream of this meeting is also available via RTD's YouTube channel. I would now like to call the roll for the committee members. Bob Broom.
Present.
Peggy Catlin.
Here.
Bobby Deschel is absent on an excused absence this evening. Lynn Geisinger.
I'm here.
Committee Vice Chair Michael Guzman.
I am here.
Joyanne Rusha.
Present.
And again, for the sake of the record, Doug Tisdale as chair is also present. And for the record, I see that we also have present with us Directors Eric Davidson, our board chair, Julian Bouquet, Marjorie Sloan, and Jamie Lewis. Have I missed any RTD directors who are present whose name I did not call? All right, thank you. I would now like to open the public comment portion of our meeting. And this is to allow anyone from the public to address the committee regarding any topic that is listed in the published meeting agenda for this current month or for the immediately preceding month. If you wish to speak and you have not already done so, please either raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone. Now, please note that during this time, the committee will not offer any direct comments or responses. However, if you would like to be contacted regarding your public comment, well, then please just email the RTD board office at rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. Mr. Executive Manager of the board, are there any hands raised or indications to make public comment?
Hi, Committee Chair Tisdale. This is Jack Kroll, Executive Manager of the Board Office. At this time, I do not see any attendees present who have raised their hand in desire of providing public comment. Excuse me.
All right, thank you. Yes. Just washed your mouth, can't do anything with it. I know how that happens. All right, then we have nothing from public comment from a presentation being made. Were there any emailed comments received for today's meeting, which is a rhetorical question because I got one, I know, but let me ask you, Mr. Kroll, if you can identify any emailed comments.
Committee Chair Tisdale, there was only the one item which I previously circulated, which is from Greater Denver Transit, and it was public comment related to the item you will take up under recommended actions with respect to Tabor.
Right, and just for the sake of clarity on that, it was a recommendation in favor of that action on the debrucing of the Tabor amendment. All right then, with no other, counting Greater Denver Transit, with no other participants in the queue, we will close public comment period at this time. The next item on our agenda is information from external entities. There is one external entity report on the agenda, and that relates to the Build America bonds. For this item, I would like to ask Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, to introduce this item, someone from his staff, and then our guest from Hilltop Securities. Mr. Chief Financial Officer, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. Good evening. Doug McLeod, Chief Financial Officer. I'm joined tonight by Brendan Morgan, Senior Manager of Debt and Investments, as well as Mike Newman, who is the Senior Managing Director and Regional Head of Investment Banking with Hilltop Securities. And Hilltop Securities is RTD's Municipal Financial Advisor. We do have a presentation to walk through that Brendan Morgan will take us through. So Brendan, the floor is yours if you're ready.
Thank you, Doug. I would be happy to. Is the board office going to pull up that presentation, or?
I can pull it up if you'd like, Brendan.
Oh, okay. If you've got it handy, that'd be great.
You got it.
Apologies. I didn't realize we were pulling those up. Well, thank you, Doug. Again, I'm Brendan Morgan. I'm the Senior Manager of Debt and Investments for the RTD, and this is an informational item that we're going to walk through regarding Build America bonds. So next slide, please. So the topics we'll cover here include the strategic priority that this informational item ties to. We'll walk through an overview of what Build America bonds, or BABs, are, why they exist, etc. We'll talk about some recent events relating to Build America bonds. And then we'll talk about RTD's existing Build America bonds that it issued way back in 2010. So as far as strategic priorities go, this information item ties directly to the financial success of RTD. In the finance department, we routinely monitor RTD's debt portfolio and look for opportunities to refinance or restructure RTD's debt in order to achieve future interest expense savings or reduce risk. Sometimes, and maybe in the short term here, we might be able to accomplish both of those things. There's been some current events that may allow RTD to accomplish both of these, or at least one of them, but we will see as time passes here. Next slide. All right, well, so we'll start with the Build America Bond overview. Build America bonds were created by the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back in 2009 to enhance capital market access for local governments and state governments. Typically, when state and local governments issue debt, we do it as a tax-exempt debt, meaning that the interest payments that we make to the investors, they get to keep those and not pay any federal income tax on those payments. This Build America Bond program encouraged local governments to issue taxable debt, where the interest payments made to the investors were indeed subject to federal sales tax. So it was a higher interest rate than what we would normally issue. To make up for that higher interest rate, the federal government agreed to provide a 35% subsidy for any interest expense paid for the life of these bonds. Unfortunately, the federal government has not paid that full 35% subsidy since 2013. This has left local governments and states that issued these to pay higher than expected interest rates since 2013. The subsidy being paid by the federal government this year is currently at 33% compared to the 35% originally agreed upon and anticipated. All right, this next slide, we'll continue on the BABS overview, is going to talk about optional redemption provisions. This is a bit of a dry topic, but it is very important given some current events that have happened. So when it comes to the ability to prepay debt for various reasons, whether an issuer wants to refinance the debt or simply pay it off early, there's typically different terms included in various types of bonds. Build America bonds have what's called a make-whole call provision, as opposed to a par call, which is common in the tax-exempt bond market. I'll explain the difference here. So when we issue tax-exempt debt, the way we normally do it, we will issue bonds and they will have what's called a par call. And it allows us, the issuer, to prepay that debt once a certain date is passed. All we have to do is pay out the amount of money that we borrowed and haven't paid back yet, that principal amount, and we can be on our merry way. The challenge is Build America bonds have what's called a make-whole call. So what a make-whole call is, you still need to pay that principal amount back, the amount that you borrowed. And then on top of that, you have to pay a premium that's essentially equal to the future value of all the interest payments that you've not made yet. So it becomes very expensive to prepay the debt early. Next slide. So Build America bonds, or BABs, typically have an optional redemption and extraordinary optional redemption provisions. Both of them are make-whole call provisions. Difference, though, one is more beneficial than the other to issuers like RTD. As I mentioned, the standard make-whole call is very expensive. The extraordinary optional redemption provision is a little bit cheaper, and the difference is really in the factor that calculates the present value of those unpaid interest payments that haven't been made in the future. So those get cheaper under the extraordinary optional redemption provision. Now, what is an extraordinary event? What would allow RTD to use that provision? That's been a good question. It's a question that we've bothered our bond counsel with a few times over the past several years. But essentially, it's an extraordinary event is anything that is a material adverse change to specified sections of the Internal Revenue Code, in a nutshell. So if that's happened, if such a change has happened, then in theory, we, the issuer, would have the right to exercise the extraordinary optional redemption provision, should the board and RTD as a district choose to do so. Next slide. So there have been some recent events, mostly around these optional redemption provisions. The biggest cornerstone recent event here was a lawsuit filed by the Indiana Municipal Power Agency versus the United States. So as I mentioned, for more than 10 years now, the subsidy for these BABS subsidies has been less than originally promised due to sequestration. The Indiana Municipal Power Agency issued BABS, just like RTD, back in 2009, 2010, and they sought to restore their full 35% subsidy payments through the courts. This case proved favorable. It provided favorable guidance for issuers of Build America bonds, like RTD. Essentially, the takeaway is that maybe we can exercise this extraordinary optional redemption provision that our bonds have. And you've seen, if you look at the municipal bond market recently, you'll see a lot of these Build America bonds being refinanced. Every month, it seems like there's a couple of them being executed as refunding or refinancing transactions. Most recently in the news, there was an article about the New York MTA. Their board authorized staff to approve, to approved for their staff to refund up to $3.7 billion of their outstanding Build America bonds. Next slide. So as a result of this lawsuit, most bond counsels now view sequestration as material adverse and therefore an extraordinary event. This conclusion gives RTD the right to exercise this extraordinary optional redemption provision. However, not all investors agree. The University of California Regents recently exercised their extraordinary optional redemption provision and received a letter from a group of some of their BABS investors stating that they believed the university had no legal basis to exercise their redemption provisions. The issuers that signed that letter were also buyers of the new bonds that were used to refinance these Build America bonds. So they were angry enough to write a letter, but not necessarily angry enough to not continue to invest in the university's bonds. Now, last week, I spoke with Director Tisdale, and he asked a very good question. He asked, of the investors that signed that letter to the university, are any of them known RTD bond investors in our Build America bonds? So that was a good question, I thought. So I worked with our underwriters, and we looked at our certificates of participation, Build America bonds. And sure enough, we did find 2 investors that do own some of those certificates of participation, Build America bonds. Now, there's $100 million of those bonds outstanding. We were able to publicly identify $87 million, the owners of $87 million of those bonds. And out of that $87 million, these 2 investors own $1.3 million of the outstanding debt. So a relatively small portion. One point I'd like to make that I think I skipped over earlier, just before we move on, regarding the subsidy. This subsidy is subject to elimination absent a waiver by the federal government of the Pay-As-You-Go Act of 2010. Now, the good news is currently the subsidy is not subject to elimination until September 30th, 2025, next year. So it's not going away this year. After September 30th of next year, we'll see. We'll see what the federal government does there. All right, next slide. And this is the last slide. All right. So RTD's BABS, what Build America bonds do we have outstanding? We issued 2 different series of Build America bonds back in 2010. The first one is on the top of this slide here. It was the Certificates of Participation Series 2010B. Those were issued for $100 million. The proceeds were used to fund various fast tracks projects, including 2 W-line parking garages. The coupon on these bonds is 7.672%. There's currently $100 million outstanding, and the final and only maturity will be paid in 2040. The second BABS that we issued were Fast Tracks sales tax bonds. They were issued for $300 million. Were used to fund various Fast Tracks projects, mostly the W line. The coupon on those is 5.844, much lower than the previous ones. Current amount outstanding is still $300 million. And again, the final and only maturity will be paid in 2050. So that's the information we've prepared for you. We'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you very much for the presentation, Mr. Morgan. That is most helpful. And what I would like to do at this time is to open up to the committee relative to the questions that you may have, unless first, let me ask of our Chief Financial Officer, does Mr. Newman from Hilltop Securities want to add anything or supplement at this time, or just wait for questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Doug McLeod, Chief Financial Officer. Before I turn it over to Mike, Mr. Newman, I'd also like to mention that this is being brought to this committee at this point in time as informational item. What our plan is to come back in July to the committee with a recommended action to actually do the refinancing of the $100 million of certificates of participation. I think the big win here for RTD is not going to be a necessarily much of an interest savings, if any savings at all, but to eliminate the risk associated with being exposed to sequestration and possibly losing that that subsidy. So as you saw, our interest rate that we're paying on those certificates of participation is north of 7%, I believe it was. That's yeah, 7.672%. That's a very high rate. If we were to pay that entire rate, it's much more expensive than our cost of capital with our other debt. I think Brendan, Mike, we're somewhere in the range of 2 to 3% on most of our other fixed rate debt. So that would be the impetus for asking the board next month in July, asking this committee to give the general manager the authority to go ahead and refinance these $100 million of COPS. The other ones, the other 300 millions of bonds are kind of out of the money. They don't make sense right now at a 5.8% interest rate. That it would cost RTD more than it would be worth probably at this point to pursue refinancing those, but those are still on the table and we'll keep monitoring those. So thank you for the opportunity. Mr. Newman, do you have anything to add?
Mr. Newman, please proceed.
I guess to supplement Brendan's comments, in addition to the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority has announced an intent to refund $376 million. As Brendan mentioned, the regions for the University of California have refunded BABS in the amount of $1.2 billion. The state of Washington similarly refunded BABS in the amount of $428 million. The Commonwealth of Kentucky, through its Turnpike Authority, refunded $128 million, and Purdue University refunded $72.4 million. So there are quite a number of municipal entities taking advantage of the current interest rate environment. As Brendan discussed in his remarks, a make-whole redemption provision is designed to make it expensive for an entity to refinance a debt, and it's designed to eliminate the ability to refinance debt for a savings. We have watched this at the direction of Doug and Brendan for a number of years. The other reason it comes to you now, one is the legal events that Brendan touched on, but we're in an interest rate where we have very high taxable rates relative to very low tax exempt rates. This is relevant because when you calculate the price to pay off the outstanding BABS, you discount those payments that are owed at the taxable U.S. Treasury rate. You fund that payment through the issuance of tax-exempt debt, and currently tax-exempt debt is a historically low percent of U.S. Treasuries, which makes this affordable. And as Brendan said, it is not one being pursued for savings, although there may be some, and there may be a loss. It is more about risk reduction. And I would ask the board members to consider these two BAB issues are the only issues that RTD has outstanding that the interest rate can change. They're the only two. So this is simply would make the certificates of participation, which are the ones that are economical, would make them like the rest of the debt of RTD. What it would also do is position RTD in future if interest rates are favorable to refund these BABs post-refunding once again, because they will be your traditional tax-exempt bonds with a 4 or 5% coupon. And when you go to refinance them, you would only, as Brendan said, pay the outstanding principal plus the accrued interest to the redemption date.
Thank you, Mr. Newman. And before turning to Director Broom, who has far more experience in this field probably than most of us on this conference at this point. Just to summarize, it's the $100 million out of the 400 million total. The 100 million that represents COPS that we are talking about doing this refunding of, and many other agencies and public entities around the country have in fact proceeded in this manner. And the two recalcitrant investors in the University of California situation, who are investors of ours, hold a total of something like 1.3 million out of our 100 million that we're talking about in this COPS. And I'm just trying to set a risk scenario for the committee to understand before proceeding to a further consideration of this. At this point, first let me ask, Mr. McLeod, have I misstated anything in my summary?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right. Director Broom, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We currently have an inverted yield curve. Would it be possible to extend the debt out and maintain the Tabor exclusion, or are these securities not involved with that issue?
That is a good question, if I might. The current final payment of the Fast Tracks debt is related to the RTD sales tax Fast Tracks bonds, and that's scheduled for the year 2050. These certificates of participation are not limited by Tabor, and that beyond that, they also mature 10 years before that final payment. So there's really nothing we could do with this particular potential refinancing that we're discussing to extend that debrucing that you're referring to.
Thank you.
And Director Broom, let me ask, does that satisfy the questions that you had at this time, sir?
It does, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there other committee members or board members who have questions either of Mr. Morgan or Mr. McLeod or Mr. Newman? I see our board chair, Director Davidson. You are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. Thank you, everybody, for the presentation here. It's very interesting and helpful. One question I had, and I apologize if I missed this, and I think maybe Mr. Newman, you were touching on this a little bit. On packet page 11 in the slides, I think it was slide 6, it's noted that the difference between the two provisions being the optional redemption versus the extraordinary is really the discount factor. So I had two questions. One is, what is the delta between the discount rates? Maybe it's three questions here. What is that delta and how are those set? It was sort of part one. And then part two, are there other provisions that we need to be thinking about that could have any ramifications beyond the discount rate?
Mr. Morgan, are you in a position to respond to that, or you want Mr. Newman to cover it?
I'm happy to take a first swing at it here. So I don't have the bond indenture in front of me right now that has those exact rates, but they are the indenture defines the discounting calculation, and it points to U.S. Treasury securities. If my memory serves me right, because I may be mixing up the bonds versus the COPS, they might be the same. I don't recall off the top of my head. However, they're somewhat flexible. It points to U.S. Treasury rates and within the past year, as I believe it's worded. So it gives a little bit of flexibility. One of the things that the University of California Regents investors were discussing was that calculation, and they wanted to be able to understand it. So I think other issuers, I suspect, are going through that with their investors as well to make sure that they're on the same page. and it's something we'll have to tread carefully with. If we were to pursue this potential refunding, we would probably notify the market ahead of time and say that this is a potential transaction that the board has approved or is going to consider, something like that at some point in the future, so that the investors have time to look at the documents and wrap their mind around it, and then come up with questions, before anything actually happens. But I'd be happy to defer to Mike Newman as well if you'd like to add any color.
Just to follow on.
Mr. Newman, please.
Following on from Brendan's remarks, the issue, setting aside a potential disagreement whether that extraordinary event has occurred, the challenge in executing the refundings has been calculating that make-whole price, because the documentation for those bond issues was not clear. That has been the overriding complaint that I've heard. Knowing that, one of the first things we did is we looked at the RTD documents, and fortunately, were reflective of the quality of bond counsel engaged by RTD. It is explicitly clear how to do the calculation in the RTD documents. To Director Davidson's question, and following along Brendan's, the discount factor is the difference between the extraordinary and the optional make-whole redemption. They both refer to the U.S. Treasury. The difference is the margin over the U.S. Treasury that is added to come up to the total discount factor. I don't recall off the top of my head what the delta is between that margin, but it's the interest margin where your delta is. Both use the same treasuries, etc. They define where we look to see the treasury rate and when we do so, but it's that margin that is different that creates the enhanced opportunity through the extraordinary. And we can follow up with you.
Okay. And Chair Davidson, is that responsive to your question then?
Perfectly, and I don't need follow up on the numbers. That answered it better than I asked the question. That's exactly what I did. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sid. And in any event, let me point out that we have between today's date, June 11, and July 14, before this matter comes back to us, potentially as a recommended action, to address various questions that might arise either in the minds of the committee, other directors, or for that matter, investors who will be receiving notice relative to RTD's consideration of this action. At this point, any other comments or questions from the committee or from any other board members? All right, seeing none, gentlemen, thank you very much for a good presentation. Messrs. Morgan and Newman, nice job on that. We appreciate it. And we now turn to our next item on the agenda, which is our regular monthly update from the Revenue Diversification Working Group. And for these purposes, we always defer to our board chair, Davidson, to present this item because he's a part of that Revenue Diversification Working Group. Chair Davidson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll keep this very simple because I'd like to defer some comments to a later agenda item. But the Revenue Diversification Working Group did meet twice since we last convened at this committee here, once on May 28th and once on June 3rd. While there have been several topics, the two primary topics of those last two meetings have really centered around the new legislation, most notably SB 2432 and SB 24184, 230, with respect to those measures that have added available revenue for transit. So SB 24230 being the oil and gas production fees, and SB 32 being methods to increase the use of transit. So we had a brief conversation around SB 32 and the $5 million that will be available for RTD to pursue for its Zero Fare for Youth program. There will be more coming on that. I expect, Mr. Chair, you to be will be the one to be shepherding that very soon here as we start to discuss that program. SB 24-230 being the oil and gas production fees, largely the conversation is too early to know how the formula funding will be calculated at the Clean Transit Enterprise, or CTE, and what revenues will be available to RTD and under which conditions. So that's certainly something that staff will continue to follow and this board will be hearing about in the months and the years ahead. As everyone will recall, the large conclusion of the Revenue Diversification Working Group when looking at our opportunities of what we can do inside the agency and what's going on more broadly was really to look to our state partners to identify new sources of funds. So this is great to see that the state is working on those, and we have work to do now in partnership. I suspect in many ways that will start to shape and inform what we would like to do with the Revenue Diversification Working Group moving forward, which I'm committed to working with Committee Chair Tisdale here to determine and with staff as well. The other major topic that we discussed, which has taken up quite a bit of the time of discussion at both of the last two meetings, is the Tabor cap calculation. And if it's okay with you, Mr. Chair, I'd like to defer some of the comments I have regarding that to one of our recommended actions, at which time I would love to make some comments to offer some of the perspectives and calculations of the group.
I think that's a prudent decision, and we appreciate your suggesting that. We'll proceed in that manner. Are there any questions or comments of Director Davidson relative to his report on the Revenue Diversification Working Group? Seeing none and anticipating there will be a fulsome discussion on the next item, we turn to the first of our two recommended actions that we have on the agenda this evening. The first recommended action is for the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, or TABOR, ballot initiative. And this recommended action is for the Board of Directors to adopt the attached resolution number blank, series of 2024, submitting a ballot question to the eligible electors of RTD at an election to be held on November 5, 2024, to wit, without imposing any new tax or increasing any tax rate, authorizing RTD to continue to collect, retain, and spend all revenues it receives from whatever sources without regard to the limitations set forth in the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, TABOR. May I have a motion?
So moved.
And is there a second to Director Geisinger's motion?
Second.
And Director Broom is the second. So I have Geisinger as the movant and Broom as the second. I would now like to call once again upon Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, to begin the presentation on this item. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. Doug McLeod, Chief Financial Officer. And I would like to defer to Board Chair Davidson to describe this item, but essentially we've brought this to this committee and the board TABOR discussions in the past on several occasions. This is a critical item for RTD, or critical concern going forward. The impact that the TABOR impact, the revenue growth limitation may have on RTD going forward. So it's definitely a concern that we've been discussing for better than 2 years now in terms of what that impact would look like. We know that it will be negative. It won't be anything good for RTD at some point. We just don't know when. So at this point, Mr. Chair, if I may turn it over to Board Chair Davidson to discuss this item, I'd appreciate it.
Board Chair Davidson, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you very much, Committee Chair Tisdale, and thank you, Mr. McLeod. I'll keep this very brief. I know we've discussed this and certainly don't want to overcomplicate this, but did want to share a few perspectives, and then very happy to answer questions as we have others here who can do so as well. As members of the committee and the board will recall, the revenues that will be subject to Tabor at the end of this year, were we not to proceed or succeed with a ballot initiative, would be approximately half of our revenues. That would be $600 million. The question then becomes, well, what is our risk exposure if we did not pursue or succeed in a Tabor exemption? And this is an interesting question that turns out to be quite difficult to answer on a looking forward basis. And I want to highlight why that is, and then highlight some of the things we've done to better quantify and understand it. I'll start with one of the simplest things we've done to quantify and understand it that we have previously reported on, and I touched on in some slides some time ago, which is talk to other government entities who have not succeeded or not pursued Tabor exemptions, and what is the magnitude of refunds that they have faced. And those ranges that we have been provided run between 7 and 11%. And that would be pretty dramatic were we to apply that to $600 million. And that gives you some idea of where the upper end of some of the risk exposure may be in a year where we have refunds. But then the next question is, okay, well, will we face that or not? What can we forecast? And at this moment, I want to talk a little bit about some of the dialogue that the Revenue Diversification Working Group has had with our subject matter experts on staff, trying to answer the question of how do we calculate our Tabor cap. And this is a little bit of a buckle up, because we are collecting sales and use tax revenue. And yet our calculation for the Tabor cap is not tied to sales and use tax and trends with consumer spending. What Tabor is tied to is our cap is calculated as a function of the revenues we collected in a given year, and then applying to that two things. A CPIU growth rate, which is the consumer price index for all urban consumers, and then a local growth factor. And that local growth factor is calculated using the net change in actual value of all real property in the district. So this is actually a function of looking at additions to taxable real property value, as well as deletions, which can come from, for example, destruction of property. So despite the fact that we're collecting sales and use tax, and should we have to refund that, that's its own question of how you even go about doing that. The calculation of our Tabor cap is tied to the consumer price index, basically inflation, and the changes to real property value within the district. So the reason I highlight that is forecasting this requires not only forecasting our sales and use tax revenues, which of course we do regularly with the CU Lead School of Business, and then looking at, are we on the low side and do we choose to look at low projections or versus more optimistic projections. It also requires visibility to inflation that is largely out of our control, and then also is tied to property value, which a number of things outside of our control, not the least of which is other legislative activity, can influence. So it becomes very difficult to forecast. What you can do is look back, and you can look back and see what may have happened in certain years. And what I would say is, to me, this is a bit as simple as a board director in looking at this. When I consider that we had polling results that were within the margin of error, close to 70% in favor of this, what we're really asking ourselves is how much risk do we want to expose ourselves to over time? We've talked about the ratchet down effect. When we have a year where economic conditions are just slightly against us, inflation isn't where we need it to be for the right cap, we didn't collect as much sales and use tax as we thought, or that change in property value wasn't as favorable, we are exposed to a refund. And once you do, you ratchet down the minimum level of revenue the maximum level of revenue you're allowed to collect. almost certainly, and most notably, if there's an economic downturn, the same thing happens and you're now subject to chronic refunds and don't get to benefit from the rebound in the economy. So one thing I did with our staff here, and it's a little hard to go hypothetical, but it's just to look back, what if we had not been exempted from Tabor coming out of the economic shock of COVID? So as we went from 2021 to 2022, what if we were not exempt from Tabor in the year 2022? Well, we would have been facing potentially, and I want to be careful on how I phrase that, and looking back to those local growth factors, potentially on the order of about $50 million, potentially a little bit more, potentially a little less. And then we'd have had a chronic effect still in the tens of millions of dollar range in the next year. That's an example of where we would have felt that shock. That shouldn't be surprising because that's on the order of magnitude we have heard in that 7 to 11% from other government entities. Are we forecasting an immediate refund right now? No, not in the year that we're currently in. But really what we're playing with and looking at is how sure are we of our revenue forecast? How sure are we of changes in our ability to forecast property value in the delta? How likely are we to be able to forecast inflation? And how confident do we feel in projecting macroeconomic conditions? And that really concludes my thought when I look at this. When I do the look back and say, wow, our risk exposure can be tens of millions of dollars in a bad year, and I see the polling results come in close to 70%, to me, it's an easy answer as a board director to say that we proceed and move forward with that. So with that, I will stop there, hand it back to you, Mr. Chair, and certainly happy if you'd like to defer to others on the call that are here to answer the questions. There is one final note I want to make, because there is the question as well, which is separate, around fair campaign practices and what the board will be able to do as we consider this. Rather than have that be part of the conversation today, I did just want to highlight to you, Mr. Chair, and to my colleagues here, call everyone's attention to the memo that was sent by General Counsel Snyder regarding fair campaign practices. Also to let you all know that her office is developing an FAQ to help guide us even further in that. And after conferring with many of you and conferring with General Counsel, I have concluded that it will be best to proceed with an executive session at our regularly scheduled board meeting at the end of the month, should the board decide to refer a measure, at which time General Counsel and her team can speak to us about the campaign issues regarding this and what RTD can and can't do. So that's a completely separate thread. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to touch on that. I'll hand the floor back to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Board Chair. We appreciate that, Director Davidson. The important point I wanted to highlight there is don't get too intimidated by this, folks, and just to bring it down a level to understand, generally speaking, after a governmental body decides to send something to the voters on the ballot, the body that sent it cannot actively campaign for or against that measure. They can, however, being free citizens entitled to their First Amendment rights, have an expression of information regarding that item, but not advocacy regarding that item. That's a very brief primer, subject to so many footnotes that this meeting would go on forever. But I wanted to give you that just so you didn't get too intimidated by the discussion. I will also note, for the sake of the record, that we have with us Dalton Kelly, an attorney from Butler Snow, who is a public finance expert with experience in these matters and a good DU Law School grad. To the extent that we have very basic information questions, he may, as appropriate, weigh in on this. But I am also advised that Mr. Kelly will be available to us at the board meeting at the end of the month, wherein we anticipate, should this matter go forward, having an executive session where we could receive further legal advice, not only from our general counsel, but from Counselor Kelly. Now, with all that said, committee members with questions or comments regarding this recommended action item to refer a ballot measure to this November's ballot for what is popularly called the debrucing of RTD. I see no committee members indicating a desire to speak at this time. Let me open it up then to other board directors who are in this meeting. Do any of you have any further questions or comments at this time? We go back to committee member Catlin for a first comment, and then we'll refer to Director Geisinger. But Madam Board First Vice Chair Catlin, your thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will be a yes vote for this. But I want to qualify it by saying I believe that there are some really good provisions generally in TABOR. But because we are asking for an extension of that which we already had as a TABOR exemption, I am in favor of that because it would essentially be a net negative if we decided not to go forward. And I believe in allowing the voters to vote on this. And so therefore I am definitely a yes on this particular measure as narrowly defined by this particular circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Catlin. We appreciate that observation. The important thing that I would like to highlight from that too is, once again, this board believes in allowing voters to have a voice in how RTD is governed and how RTD proceeds. Madam Board Second Vice Chair Geisinger, Director Geisinger, you are recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to add my voice. I think that this is the right thing to do. As our chair said, our polling numbers were very good, 68, 70%. We looked at a sunset provision, decided it was very close in terms of what support we were giving. We are already getting lots of people who are asking about what the situation is and wanting to be educated. Thank you for your comments and for setting the executive session for the Chair Davidson. I think that we will be looking to all of the board to work with your constituents and your electeds and others to understand what we're doing. And just to be clear, as elected officials, we do get to have opinions and share those with the people around us in terms of supporting this. So it'll be a big season, and I'd say I definitely agree. Let's move it forward.
And thank you very much, Director Geisinger. We appreciate that. And in particular, because his name was invoked, but also because he has raised his hand. Board Chair Davidson, you are recognized, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just would be remiss in, I just did want to say this a lot of effort has gone into getting to this place and understanding and quantifying this. Thank you to everybody on staff who has participated and helped with this. But I would also like to just say, just as she spoke, thank you to Second Vice Chair Geisinger for her leadership. The investigation under this, the drive to go after this really started under your leadership as chair. And you have not let this issue go and been pushing on it, and really appreciate the help, and just wanted to publicly thank you for the leadership and the work in making this get to this point. Thank you.
Very appropriate, and we appreciate that expression. Are there other committee members who wish to weigh in at this point? Otherwise, I'm going to open up to the other board directors in this meeting to add any comments that they might choose. So please indicate by raising your hand I see at this time there are no indications of any committee members or directors with a desire to speak further on this topic. So we will then proceed to the vote on the resolution on this recommended action, with the movant being Director Geisinger and the second being Director Broom. Let me ask, are there any no votes on this action? Then we have 6 votes in favor, no negative votes, and no abstentions. Therefore, that motion passes unanimously, and the matter will proceed to the full board for our regular board meeting at the end of this month. The second recommended action this evening is for the Central Park Station development negotiation. This is a recommended action for the Board of Directors to authorize the General Manager and CEO or her designee to negotiate and execute an exclusive negotiation agreement, referred to as an ENA, with Ulysses Development Group for the future lease and development of the real property located at 3801 North Ulster Street, Denver, Colorado. May I have a motion?
So moved.
I have Vice Chair Guzman as the movant. Is there a second?
Second.
Second.
I heard Director Geisinger first, so I'll take you as the second on this matter, and recognize one thing I'd like to emphasize first for the discussion, to keep it in context. This is for an exclusive negotiation agreement. This is not the consummation of a lease or sale of property. It is to approve a negotiation agreement. And so I would call upon Chessie Brady, who is the manager of transit-oriented development of RTD, to present this item. Ms. Brady, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. Yes, good evening. I'm Chessie Brady, Transit-Oriented Development Manager, and happy to bring this to you this evening. As Chair Tisdale summarized from the action itself, this is authorization from the board for to negotiate with the developer, Ulysses Development Group, about this westernmost parcel in the Central Park Station. It is generally an exclusive negotiation agreement is mostly to give confidence to Ulysses Development Group, UDG, that we are exclusively negotiating with them. They can invest time, they can invest money. We're not talking to anybody else. And during this process, we will begin and terminate and finalize the negotiation of a ground lease. But to start, it's just kind of opening the doors to get to that ground lease, which will eventually bring back to the board when we have a set of terms. So I went through the presentation when this was a discussion item last month. I'm not going to go through it again, but I do have it. I'm happy to bring it up if there are questions or to answer any other questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Brady. And yes, we did ask Ms. Brady if she could forego simply presenting what she already told us just a month ago, figuring that we could at least remember what happened last month. And so we're here now for any further questions, clarification, or issues associated with the motion that anyone would like to raise. So let me go first to Board Second Vice Chair Geisinger. You are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Brady. I noted in the board report that it mentions the new legislation, which I think was ultimately SB 230, that authorized RTD to sell property at a less than fully fair market value. Is that that's a piece of this conversation? Is that something that may make a difference here?
Ms. Brady?
Thank you. Yes, the ground lease, the price of the ground lease itself will be an important topic that we will negotiate with the developer. Up until this point, we were expecting it to be fair market value. I have no doubt that they will request less than fair market value. And we'll work with the board and work with staff to determine, and also work with our partners in the state and the city to determine what is appropriate, what makes sense for RTD. We have the equitable TOD policy, and we'll use that as guidance, but we'll come back to the board with more information about that policy in general in the coming months.
Thank you very much. Moving that policy forward a couple of years ago, maybe even longer, and for moving this forward. It's great. Thanks.
And to quote an ancient maxim of the law, there's no harm in asking. So perhaps they will, cognizant of that statutory change, make such a request. Mr. Vice Chair Guzman, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Brady, I just want to make sure I'm just not sure on this. We're not talking about selling this real estate. We're talking about a long-term lease on this property, correct? Just for clarification.
Ms. Brady.
Thank you. Yes. The only disposition method under consideration is ground lease. We are not considering leasing. We're not considering selling the property.
Thank you for that clarification. I think that's something that we all need to make sure we keep in mind as we look at these dispositions of real property. Are there other questions from the committee relative to this second recommended action as moved by Vice Chair Guzman and seconded by Director Geisinger? Director Ruscia, you are recognized.
Thank you, sir. Just for our edification, could staff once again repeat, because we have the word execution in this recommended action, the line between staff's delegation and what the board would eventually have to approve?
Thank you very much, Director Ruscia. And I think that Ms. Brady can respond to that, but I will initiate the response by saying, again, this is for a negotiation agreement to be entered into as an exclusive negotiation agreement. It is not the actual disposition of the property by way of lease or otherwise, which is a separate matter that would come back before the board for final approval. But let me ask Ms. Brady to weigh in and affirm or refute what I have said.
Thank you, Chair. I think you covered it. It is indeed, I'm looking at the action. It is for the general manager and CEO or her designee to negotiate and execute an exclusive negotiation agreement and for a future lease. So no disposition approval at this time.
Thank you very much. Director Ruscia, does that respond to your question?
It does, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make sure I understood because we also had similar actions in recent history, and I had just taken a look at our unsolicited, property proposal guidelines and was making sure we haven't deviated from that. And if I could put this in more plain language, my understanding is that we had a proposal, that was effectively put out to bid, for lack of a better phrase, and RTD said, I choose you to continue the conversation, and that's where we are. So I just wanted to make sure that my understanding is what is transpiring, and it sounds like that is the case. I also just wanted to make a comment, and I alluded to this at our last meeting. The initial proposal for this development, as stated by the developer in the public forum, has changed a little bit from what staff has presented us, including the number of units and potentially how many would be affordable, and what and how affordable will be measured. And so to that end, if staff has any more updates since we last spoke, I think that would be helpful for the board to chew on before this goes for action at the board meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. And obviously, without negotiating against ourselves in this discussion and creating lines in the sand that may or may not be mutable, let me ask Ms. Brady if she has any comment in response to your question.
So this, as stated in the action in the report, their UDG is expecting at this point approximately 800 affordable units. Sometimes they have submitted documents that say 800, they have said more, and that will continue to change over the next, during the negotiation period, based largely on financing, which comes from the federal government, the state government, city governments. So we will be watching that very closely, but our intent is to, or I should say, RTD's, our staff intent is to achieve high density and high levels of affordability on the site.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brady. And Director Ruscia, I see your hand has popped up again. I take it you'd like some further clarification on that. You're recognized for that purpose.
Thank you, sir. Just maybe a comment. Director Geisinger had referenced a recent change to state statute, and that is, a tool we have in our toolbox. And I would just opine this is also a matter of public interest, and so I just strongly encourage staff and leadership to, if we move forward, to see what is possible to make those units as affordable as possible. Just as several people have noted in and out of this forum, that using a metric such as AMI is not necessarily what most people quantify as a affordable unit. So I recognize that this potential partner might have some restraints, especially if there are HUD dollars attached. But I think I just, again, want to encourage staff to use the tools that we have in our toolbox to cover those gaps. Thank you so much. And I also just really appreciate the team for working on this. It's in my district, and I hope to be at the ribbon cutting ceremony if all proves successful and beneficial.
Thank you very much, Director Ruscia, and a very worthwhile annotation by you relative to this dialogue. Thank you. Director Broom, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Will there be shared parking use at this site, and/or will there be diminished parking based on the fact that this is close to a TOD site? And has there been any experience in Denver where projects have been built with less parking, and what has occurred on the side streets around those projects?
Thank you, Director Broom. And Ms. Brady, I know that you had addressed some of those parking issues in your presentation previously, so you may have that information readily at hand. If you could respond to Director Broom's question, please.
Sure. Right. So there's two ways of looking at parking on this site. One is the removal or reduction of RTD customer parking. And the plan is to remove the approximately 650 RTD spaces currently located on the parcel. As I describe in the action, we feel that that's an acceptable reduction based on current utilization and even past utilization. The other side of the parking equation is how many parking spaces would be provided for the future residents. And Denver has very liberal laws or ordinance requirements for requiring parking for residents, especially in affordable developments. So the parking requirement from a zoning perspective would be very low to nothing. And so we will work with the developer to ensure that they are providing enough parking so that there is not spillover into the other RTD parcels, which would happen on this site. And this is something that we follow very closely throughout for affordable developments, market rate developments across the district, and are really trying to keep tabs on in order to make sure that we're building the right amount of parking. Not too much, not too little. So, and that's a changing data point as well. So we will keep watching that as this development becomes more concrete.
Sounds like we want Goldilocks parking. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Broom, for stealing my line. I was going to say, we have built something that is Papa Bear parking, and our usage has definitely been Mama Bear on a diet. And I think that's some of what has motivated the willingness of staff to present this item to us at this time. Director Broom, did you have anything further you wish to say at this time?
Not at this time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, sir. Director Lewis, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Chessie, for all the work you're doing on this. As you know, this is just the beginning of a long process. As you know, the media only reports on RTD if there's something negative going on. So I'm just curious if we can squeeze some PR out of this while it's fresh, because obviously, we're talking a year, 2 years down the line before this thing actually starts to actually grow. So I'm hoping maybe you can work with our department to get something out there to the media.
I have done the interview, so we'll see if it becomes an article.
Thank you very much, Director Lewis. Anything further from you on that point, Director Lewis, or any other point?
I'm fine. Thank you, Director.
Thank you. And I know that Mr. Stuart Summers, our Director of Marketing and Communications, is here with us as well. And I am certain he's taking copious good notes relative to all of this. So we thank you for that affirmation, Mr. Summers. Any other comments from any committee member or from any board director relative to this second recommended action? Seeing none, we're ready for a vote on this. And at this time, I would ask for any no votes on this recommended action that was moved by Committee Vice Chair Guzman and seconded by Second Vice Chair Geisinger. The chair hears no votes, and therefore the vote will be recorded as 6 members of the committee in favor, no members of the committee opposed, and 1 excused absence from this meeting. That concludes the recommended actions that we have on our agenda this evening. Now we will move on to our discussion items, where we have 4 discussion items that are listed on the agenda. The first of these discussion items is the Zero Fare for Youth pilot program. And I would like to ask at this time, once again, for our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. Doug McLeod, to present this item with his staff. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Doug McLeod, Chief Financial Officer. I am joined this evening by Monica Triple-Harnke, who is RTD's Senior Manager of Revenue. I would like your permission, Mr. Chair, to relinquish the floor to Ms. Triple-Harnke as I pull up the presentation. We have a presentation to walk through for this discussion item.
Thank you very much. It's the committee's pleasure to hear Ms. Triple-Harnke now. Assuming that is that she goes off mute.
There we go. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay, yeah, I had some funny messages. Okay, so thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, my name is Monica Triple-Harnke, and I will be Senior Manager of Revenue, and Doug McLeod very kindly offered to run the presentation for me. This is going to be pretty brief, I think, and I apologize for the strange background here. I'm just going to briefly go over the background of the Zero Fare for Youth program at RTD, about the pilot program, and then the next steps about extending this Zero Fare for Youth initiative for an additional school year. So let's start with that. So the system-wide, this all started with the system-wide fair study and equity analysis, the goals of which were equity, affordability, and simplicity. This was an initiative that fit all these three goals. It was originally started as a pilot program and was still in the pilot program phase. The purpose of this pilot program was to provide no-cost transit to youth, children and youth, up to or ages 19 and under. So really until your 20th birthday, you're eligible. And this would be free boarding on all RTD services. And yeah, so that we worked really hard to get that going for the school year, last school year, starting in September 2023. It was a pilot program. We were able to get an extension from the FTA and the permission to do this for 12 months rather than just 6 months in order to capture a full school year. The fair change requirements, should we now continue this program, for the FTA do kick in, meaning an equity analysis is required. This was not required for a pilot program. And Carl Green, our Director of Civil Rights, did present that to you last month in this committee meeting. So let's keep going. This is just for comparison. Under this current fair structure that we have in place, there is a youth fair. It is just not being collected right now for this 12-month period. So the youth fair would be 85 cents for the 3-hour pass. And currently everything is $0. And then of course we have the day and monthly pass prices as well. This is a 70% discount off the regular standard fare. Okay. So the evaluation of the pilot, and also some of it was already in the equity analysis, the draft equity analysis that Carl Green presented last month. It was operational impacts where we were wondering if there would be some negative ones, and really there weren't any. Either there were no operational impacts or very minimal. Community and customer feedback was very positive from inception of the program to now, good media coverage as well. Financial impacts were below the forecasted foregone revenue, and we'll look into that in a little bit. And of course, we at RTD want to encourage the early use of transit. Let me just move my computer so I'm not in the sun anymore. Okay. All right. So we'll talk about the increase right now with this slide, but I think we can really say this has been a really big success. So let's talk about the increase and what we would expect. So you see this jump in youth boardings based on the Zero Fare for Youth initiative. And this assumes that the initiative would continue under, not as a pilot, but as a regular program. This was based on data that was collected also in conjunction with the equity analysis. And it's really based on bus boardings, counted bus boardings on our fixed route buses. Let's see. So I should narrate this a little bit. So you see that we estimated 10.4 million youth boardings in 2023, which was an increase from the 9.3 million in 2022. And we would expect another jump to 13.7 million youth boardings in 2024. So just as a reminder, being that it started, the pilot program started in September. It means that 2023 had a few months of the pilot program, and 2024, should this program continue, will have a full 12 months of the Zero Fare for Youth. Okay, and then foregone revenue. So there's the estimate for foregone revenue is 2.9 million. This is actually for 2025, so 2.8 million for 2024. I do want to explain the chart a little, because you can see a 2023 revenue. This is not foregone revenue, but this is actual revenue collected from youth boardings, and that's 3.7 million. And what our consultants did is they took the youth boarding numbers and assumed if we hadn't provided Zero Fare for Youth, then the numbers would not increase. And so the numbers pretty much stayed the same or increased very moderately for the boardings, but then the average revenue per boarding decreased because of our new fare structure. So there's two things that changed, just as in September 2023, we started the Zero Fare for Youth program. And then, as we know, in January 2024, all the fare decreases took effect. So we're kind of looking at two different variables here. And that's how we come up with this 2.8 million in foregone youth fare revenue. It's only a very slight increase predicted for the years afterwards, because by the time the program is fully implemented, youth ridership would stay pretty much stable and just grow by the regular, overall ridership forecasts for our overall ridership. Okay. Okay, so the impact. We contacted some school districts, or all of them, but got some responses about a positive impact to truancy rates. That was specifically Boulder Valley School District. And then we had some other feedback about higher regular usage by students, usage for field trips by students and teachers, but we didn't get numbers for that. That was more of an anecdotal conversation. Before this pilot was started, there was some internal and external conversation. Will this lead to disruptive behavior, maybe, if we have more youth boarding and children? And there's no issues reported. Nothing of significance, nothing systemic. Of course, customer boarding is faster when there is no fares to be paid, people looking for cash. And then from a public input perspective for this more permanent program, this is going to be part of the service changes public process. So this is, for example, there'll be 6 public meetings, and they're going to start next week. So there's going to be 6 meetings over 2 weeks. And this is going to be, the Zero Fare for Youth will be part of the presentations at those meetings, and people will have an opportunity to provide feedback, people and organizations. So we'll have that information. The Title VI analysis, I already mentioned that Carl Green, our Director of Civil Rights, he presented to you last month at this committee meeting. There was no disparate impact or disproportionate burden present for customers covered under the Civil Rights Act, under the Title VI. So no impact on, or no negative impact on minority and low-income populations. Okay, let me just keep going. So the estimated financial impact, we already saw that on the last slide. We expect about 2.9 million in foregone youth fair revenue. That's for the year 2025. We expect about $410,000 in estimated expenses. That would be marketing, language assistance, survey, providing an annual report, and then there might be some other miscellaneous expenses as we get and understand the grant rules and see what other expenses may be covered. And speaking of grant rules, the Senate Bill 24032 was passed in May and signed by the governor. Its methods to increase the use of transit. So under this state grant, or it establishes a state grant, $5 million available for 1 year. This is specific to RTD and specific to the provision of free services for youth, or zero fare services for youth. Grant rules and grant applications will be available in July. And should the board decide, RTD will apply for this grant. And then future funding is subject to future state appropriations. So while we like to say, oh, instead of a pilot program, let's make this a permanent program, from a state funding perspective, it's really going to be year by year, subject to the appropriations. And then next steps. So I keep referring to it. You already heard from Carl Green, the preliminary equity analysis last month. Now we are having this conversation about the discussion item for extending the program beyond the pilot. So next month in July will be the kind of official discussion. The Title VI equity analysis will be presented again by Carl Green and will be for your consideration as a recommended action, and also the recommended action to extend this program past the pilot program. So past August 2023 will also be coming to you on July 16th. And then 2 weeks later, July 30th, we will be asking for, your final consideration and approval, if that is desired. And that will be, again, the Title VI equity analysis and the program continuation. And thus, thank you. And please ask any questions.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Ms. Tripel-Harnke, nice presentation. And this is a matter that we have discussed numerous times over the course of this committee, including the excellent presentation by Mr. Carl Green relative to the Title VI impact. So I know that many questions that were had previously have already been responded to, but this is an opportunity first for committee members to ask any questions or to make any comments relative to this discussion item. You're not being requested to take any action tonight, but to have further discussion. So are there any committee members with questions or comments relative to the Zero Fare for Youth pilot? Mr. Vice Chair, you are recognized, sir.
I just want to say thank you for putting the numbers together in terms of foregone revenue as compared to what is available. I'll be interested to see what happens, but given that the state made it dependent on future appropriations, I'm grateful for having that available, because I'm really excited about having the free fare for youth, especially since that is all year long and it serves a much needed purpose. So I just wanted to say that that was one thing that I was wondering about. So I'm glad it's in the presentation. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. I appreciate that. And I do want to say, and I see that Mr. Summers is still with us here, I loved the ad that we put out on social media of, and I'll say this word even though someone may criticize me later, but the chubby little boy jumping up and down because summer was going to be free on the RTD and he was going to have fun going everywhere. And I say that because I was that chubby little boy. And I very much appreciated seeing that. And I thought it was a wonderful message that we shared. Are there any other members of the committee first, and then if not, other directors who would like to make a comment or question? Madam First Vice Chair Catlin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make an acknowledgement to former Director Kate Williams. She worked tirelessly on this, and I know that she would be very pleased to see the results of this, and also the action going forward. So just a shout out to Kate.
Thank you. That's very nice of you to share that with us. I appreciate that, Director Catlin. Director Ruscia, you are recognized.
Thank you. I had a comment. Given that the state did not fund free fare for better air this year, and right now this program is dependent upon grants, I just wanted to offer that, at some point we make a commitment to this program beyond any pilot phase. Of course, we would aggressively pursue funds, but I would hate to see this program, go away in the future because we didn't have an outside funding source. And like noted, as others have noted, I'm very grateful to staff for going through this work, and also for former Director Williams as well. I think this is really great for our agency.
Thank you very much, Director Ruscia. And yes, you do raise a question that we know we will have to deal with at some point in the future, and that is whether we can convince the state to renew its funding after this first year that they have guaranteed funding, and also what other revenue sources might be available in the future should that not happen. Thank you. Director Broom, you are recognized now, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Has staff taken a look at what they could give up in some other program areas in order to continue that program?
And let me ask Ms. Triple-Harnke or Mr. McLeod probably would be the best person in the first instance to respond. So Mr. McLeod, let me go to you, sir.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. Great question. We have not at this point. The concern obviously was going into past the pilot program not having funding and trying to identify that funding. We didn't know what the impact would be. So thank you to Ms. Triple-Harnke for all her work pulling together those numbers. $2.9 million plus advertising. And some of the other costs that were described in that 410,000 other miscellaneous items to continue promoting the program. That portion would probably go away. So we'd be faced with simply with the loss of foregone revenue in the event or at the end of the current grant period, assuming that we move forward with this item. So it would be essentially looking to find approximately $3 million. I believe at that point in time, if that grant were to go away, we could identify a specific item. It's a relatively small amount in the whole budget and the entire revenue for RTD. So not a current material concern, I would say, but we certainly would look at that.
Well, I guess I was looking at the other program, the one for clean air.
And so the question then is relative to our Zero Fare for Better Air program, I think is where Director Broom is directing your attention, Mr. McLeod. So any thoughts on that?
Thank you. Yes. And so because funding is not being made available in the current year, in 2024, RTD will not move forward with zero fare for better air. There are a couple of individual days. We will be coming back to the board regarding free fare on election day, and National Vote Early Day would be the recommended action there. We also have New Year's Eve as a free day. Currently, there's no plans to offer any other free days other than what's been discussed here with zero fare for youth. If the committee were to move forward with that.
I guess I just feel like it's really hard to start and stop programs like this. You lose a lot of momentum.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes, please, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. And also, one of the things too is that's very difficult on staff, as well as, not only administrative staff, but certainly our operators and our security personnel, is the occasional implementation of zero fare days, as you can imagine, plus the costs associated with getting word out, et cetera. It did have some good benefits to it, but the loss in revenue, in 2023, the 2 months, July and August, the replaced fare revenue was approximately $14 million. So absent that grant funding in 2024, that's a more significant number that RTD would have to make up, plus the additional fact of the additional working with vendors to turn off machines at certain points of time, et cetera. So yes, it's not being contemplated in 2024.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Broom. We appreciate your participation on that and bringing that important matter back up. Mr. Vice Chair, you are recognized, sir.
Just real quick, board packet page 21, bullet number 5 that we have discussed previously, specifically calls this out in that ask to the public in terms of identifying funds, saying providing transportation services for youth 19 years of age or younger at reduced or no fares in the potential ballot measure that we will be discussing going forward in the resolution. So I just want to point that out. We've kind of tackled this previously. It just needs to come back to us for a vote. That's all.
Thank you, sir. And Madam Board Second Vice Chair Geisinger, you are recognized.
Thank you very much. Just to follow up on Director Broom's question about the free fare for zero fare for better air, and I certainly appreciate the concerns that our CFO has raised, and I know y'all have looked at this. I think this year that not having it wasn't funded, and not doing it makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of maintenance projects going, and doing the two at the same time is problematic. But I would like to see the conversation continue in the future, and it'd be great to get it funded. But even if it's just 1 month or a shorter period, and there's a way to, as Director Broom said, move something else around. I think that it's a very popular program, and one that's worth considering in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Director Geisinger. Director Lewis, you are recognized now, sir.
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback on what Peggy and Joanne were saying. One of Kate's cue lines was that we're building a new generation to use RTD products in the future. So if you think about it, it actually pays for itself, because these kids are going to be wanting to get their pass as soon as they turn 20. But one comment or question I wanted to ask our presenter, Monica. I know there's a little gap there. It costs $2.7 million, but there's $5 million available. Not that we'd want to spend all this money on this particular subject, but I was wondering if there are any efforts to utilize some money to get out to more languages, especially in the area of Aurora. From what I understand, there's like 65 different languages in that particular city. And I hate to use that old expression, leave no kid behind. There's probably pockets of communities out there that have no clue about what's going on. So I'm hoping maybe we use some money to get to some of those community centers and other places where the language is a barrier.
Thank you, Director
Miss-
Lewis. A very valid point, because we have spoken in the past in this committee and others relative to the phenomenal diversity of languages that we have represented in the Regional Transportation District. And I know that all of our collateral materials are considered carefully for translation into various languages. And I know that Mr. Summers and others are addressing that. Are there other comments or questions from any committee member or any board member relative to this second discussion item on zero fare for youth? Seeing none, Ms. Triple-Harnke, thank you very much for an excellent presentation, as always, one that gets a lot of great interest. I will point out to the board that it's now approximately 12 minutes after the hour of 7. And although we don't have that much more to go, I am advised that it is necessary for our transcribers to take a break from time to time, and that we need to afford them that opportunity. And so, as I have sometimes said in the past when doing presentations, I always like to give my audiences an opportunity to escape at some point. This, ladies and gentlemen, is your opportunity. We will take a brief recess. We will resume at 7:25. That's 7:25 p.m. for our next 3 discussion items, which I don't think will take an overlong period of time. So thank you very much for your patience. And this committee will now stand in recess until 7:25 p.m. Thank you. Staff, if I may ask for you, please to resume the recording of this meeting. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is now 7:25 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. We are reconvened after our brief recess in order to conclude this June 11th meeting of the RTD Finance and Planning Committee. Our second discussion item this evening is the Q1 2024 financial update. That's our financial update for the first quarter of 2024. And we now call once again upon the tireless Chief Financial Officer of RTD, Mr. Doug McLeod, to introduce this item to the committee. Mr. McLeod, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale. Doug McLeod again. So I do have a slide presentation here just to give the committee an update on the financial position and financial results for RTD through the first quarter. Why we chose the first quarter is we did not receive the April sales and use taxes until yesterday, but I will comment on that as I go through. So we don't yet have April financial statements available. Okay. So what I'll talk about tonight is the current results for the first 3 months of the year versus budget, and also discuss the financial position. Take a look at historical trends to put things into context, where we were and where we are currently. Have a little more in-depth discussion about fund balances, and then finish up with some of the challenges we see going forward. And most of this discussion is not only to provide an update, but also in preparation, just a level set for coming items, including the discussion next month, which will be a preliminary look at the 5-year financial forecast, formerly known as the midterm financial plan. We'll have a discussion item in July for the committee discussing some of those items. And then we'll be coming back in September to ask for approval of that 5-year financial forecast, and then go into the budget discussions for 2025. So just taking a quick look at the first 3 months of 2024, and of course everybody knows we're on a calendar year, fiscal year basis. So we budget for and we record our financial statements on a 12-month basis, ending December each year. I've encapsulated the revenues here. At the top is the actual versus budget, and then versus prior year. At the bottom half of that section with numbers, it shows the variances of actuals to each of the above columns. So, so for instance, fair revenue through 3 months is 2 million, and these are the thousands numbers are dropped off, so these are in millions. So, excuse me, these are in thousands. So fares, for instance, the number in bracket there about in the middle of the page is a variance of $2,313,000 versus budget. So actual results are $2.3 million under budget, $5 million under prior year, same time. The main reason for the difference year over year to prior year is the change in the fare structure. That's to be expected. I'm not too concerned about the fares versus budget of $2.3 million shortfall. It's relatively small, and it was based on certain projections, so we need to kind of watch that as the year goes to see how that materializes. Projections based on the new fare structure. Sales and use tax. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the challenges section, but what you can see here is through 3 months, RTD is $8.2 million below budget. Keep in mind that the budget was built and approved by the board in November for 2025. Since that time, we've gotten a revised forecast from CU Leads in March. That revised forecast is down slightly. So they are actually, at CU Leads, the economists there are actually expecting a downturn based on some of the results we're seeing, which are shown here. So we're $8.2 million under budget this far on sales and use taxes. Grants, again, this is not a concern. It has to do with the timing of the budget. So we show a negative $57 million variance to budget at this point in time. What generally happens is we spread the budget for the grant funding that RTD receives, 5307 preventive maintenance funds, across several months. And then it depends on when the application is approved and when we can start drawing money down with Federal Transit Administration. So we will make up this difference by year end. So no concerns there. And then other revenue, that's just miscellaneous revenue. It's relatively small, but it kind of offsets some of the shortfalls in fares. And it's really due to improved or better than expected investment returns, and then some miscellaneous receipts for things that we receive, such as insurance settlements and the like. So that's not a number that we really rely on from a budgeting perspective, but it is trending positive. So overall, $61 million under revenue, with the bulk of that being from timing on grant funding. Expenditures through the first 3 months. Again, same format here, and what we've done is we've broken out operating expenses, debt service, and capital expenditures thus far. Again, focusing on that middle section there, the lower section, operating expenses are to the good, positive variance there of 27 million. So we're under what we had budgeted by 27 million. A big portion of that is attributable to several things: lower than expected purchase transportation, which is our contracted service for both bus and fixed route, as well as paratransit. Also, utilities are under budget, insurance is under budget, and other outside services, all totaling about 27 million. So that's trending about what we usually see. We're usually under budget throughout the year. And we're working, through the budgeting process to tighten up those variances. But again, a lot of these budgeted appropriations need to be fully appropriated upfront by the board through the budgeting process in order to issue purchase requisitions and go forward with the contracting process per state law. Debt service is just a little bit under budget. Again, that's due to some offsetting investment income that we get on debt service reserves and the like. So another good piece of information there. And then capital expenditures are slightly over budget at 1.9. Those tend to fluctuate, 1.9 million. Those tend to fluctuate based on, when we put the assumption together, when those expenditures will occur during the year. So I anticipate, obviously, we can't go over the appropriated amount, so I anticipate us coming closer to the budgeted amount. So all told, expenditures $27 million under budget versus the 60 or so under budget on revenue. Again, I'm not personally concerned too much about these items because we're only 3 months into the year and we have a ways to go. Moving into financial position. So those are results, the transactions, the money in and out, fund balances that I just spoke of, or the fund sources and uses through that 3-month period. Where do we stand from a financial position? So if we look at our balance sheet as of March 31st, 2024, we have total cash and investments. And again, the zeros are dropped, last 3 zeros are dropped off this. RTD has $1,300,113,000 in cash and investments. And why this is on this screen is that's a critical component, what's available to RTD potentially to spend before subtracting all liabilities and other obligations. Down slightly from the prior year. Again, that's due to just timing of cash flows regarding some of the expenditures. We have to spend grant money up front and then draw it later, et cetera. So cash and investments, that's our liquidity position. That's how much money is basically available for RTD to spend. Fund balances is what's left over after we subtract out everything that's due. So basically all of our liabilities. So if you were to look at our balance sheet within the monthly financial statements, you would see, you have to add up a few numbers, but you would see these numbers. Again, very strong position on fund balances, $1.2 billion, pretty flat to the same time last year. So just to summarize what I've discussed so far regarding financial results, revenue is a little behind expectations. We do have a positive expenditure variance offsetting some of that revenue shortfall, and we do have a strong financial position. So this will all be key as we move into looking to the future for our 5-year financial forecast as well as our budget. Just quickly going over some historical trends. These graphics are actually included in the monthly financial statements that you've seen. I just wanted to have the opportunity to discuss this and show what's happened historically. So over on the left, the far left numbers start in 2018. And the 2 graphics, the 2 lines, the red and the green, drop below 0. So what the red and the green are, those are the fund balances. That's the money that's left over that's available. And I'll talk quite a bit here, not a lengthy period of time, but I'll talk a little bit about fund balances and the board's role in that. But Fast Tracks is shown in red, Bay System is shown in green. But what you can see is in 2018, is at that point in time, we didn't have enough money to necessarily pay off all obligations if they were to come due at that point in time. Doesn't necessarily mean we were bankrupt, because some of these obligations are way out into the future. But it's very important not to be in a position where the fund balances are negative. The top line, the blue line, is the trends in our cash and investments. But what you can see with the red and green lines is we've markedly improved as an agency our fund balances, while also improving our cash and investment position. So when we talk about being in a strong financial position, this is indicative of that. So those two fund balances amounts are funding that's available per the board purview to use for certain purposes. Now I'll talk about some of the obligations that we still have that probably I would recommend those fund balances be used for. The flip side of the coin when you look at our balance sheet is, what do we owe? If you go back in time, 2016, this graph starts to show a nice trend line of 8 or 9 years here. This graphic shows the big obligations that RTD has. So in blue is the total debt profile. So everything in the principal amount of debt owed to our investors that was borrowed in 2016 is $3.9 billion. And then the other large obligation that was on our balance sheet at the time was the pension liabilities of $320 million in the red box there at the top. You can see the trend as it goes forward. And part of the reason for that, so if you get to 2021, you can see we start to see significant decreases in those amounts. So moving all the way over to 2024, we're left with currently the outstanding principal has dropped from 2016 $3.9 billion down to $3.4 billion. Part of that's actual debt service that's been paid, but a lot of it's also due to the debt refinancings that have occurred in more recent years when we had the opportunity. So we refinanced that for interest savings, took out some of the principal balance at the same time, and reduced the risk to RTD. The pension obligation, $165 million, down from $320 million. You may recall in 2022. With the new collective bargaining agreement, the Amalgamated Transit Union and RTD worked together to try to address the large pension obligation that was out there. And you'll recall that that pension plan was closed to new employees for represented employees going forward in 2023. And there was also a large payment of $160 million, a lump sum put into that plan to shore that plan up, also reducing the risk profile to RTD. So we've taken some steps as an agency to really reduce not only our obligations and increase our financial position, but also to reduce some of the risks associated with some of these financial items. Moving into fund balances. So I've got this broken down by the types of fund balances. And essentially what the fund balances are is if you take RTD's assets minus its liabilities, what's left over is fund balance, also known in the private sector as equity, owner's equity. So it's really essentially the savings that are left over if RTD were to pay off all of its obligations. So this should be the same numbers as the prior slide with the line graph. What I will point out in the Bay System column is I realized that the $511 million at the bottom, 511,463, should be $695,000. I'll fix that, get this presentation updated. The pensions were taken out of that number, but that's the difference. So that number is showing lower than it should be, and it should all go into the unrestricted fund. But just moving down each line item here. So we've got a column for Bay System, a column for Fast Tracks. We have to keep that money separate. Fast Tracks cannot pay for the Bay System except for the feeder service that we've talked about previously. So Fast Tracks funding has to remain only for Fast Tracks. Just walking down through here. So there's restricted fund balances that we don't often talk about because those are restricted by contract or agreement, such as debt agreements. That's money that has to be set aside to service debt, for instance. We also have a restricted Tabor reserve that's required of all governmental agencies in Colorado to maintain a 3% TABOR reserve, 3% of certain revenues. So those monies are essentially untouchable for covenant. So total there is 183.6 million. Then we get into the board, the funds that fall under board auspices. So this is the remaining money after you take out restricted reserves. So through the fiscal policy that the board has approved and through discussions, there are essentially four different fund balances. I use the word funds and reserves interchangeably. The operating reserve has been established as 3 months of operating expenses excluding depreciation. That number is 257.2 million. Again, that's up to the board's purview. All these items are under the board's purview as to appropriate and to be used. So if anybody wanted to use any of this funding, the board would have to give explicit approval. Capital replacement fund. So through the budgeting process, while we had this good cash position, we identified $185 million to set aside for capital replacement. That has to do with our state of good repair, the transit asset management plan, and having that funding available so we do not have to, in the short term at least, borrow money and pay additional interest costs. Fast Track's internal savings account, a lot of discussion about that recently, and I have a couple more slides to go into a little more detail about the FISA. What is in there currently is $190 million, 99,000. That is a fund balance established by the board several years ago at the time to put money away for future Fast Tracks projects. And then finally, the unrestricted fund. So the unrestricted fund is showing as $412 million, but it should be $412 million plus another 200. So there's about $600 million. Sorry, again, I'll fix that. $600 million, that's everything that's left over that hasn't been identified by the board for set aside funds in the three preceding line items. Again, that whole bottom section is really up to the board's purview as to how to spend that. Now, staff may come with recommendations based on our 5-year financial forecast or based on the budget. For instance, the capital replacement fund, its needs are identified rather than going out and borrowing money. During the budgeting process, staff would come to the board potentially and ask to use a portion of that $185 million to apply towards state of good repair, for instance. So again, restricted are contractual or statutory requirements such as TABOR. All the other items are under the board auspices. The board has the authority to spend, and only the board can appropriate those funds. So to touch on the FISA, there's been a lot of questions recently about the Fast Track's internal savings account. So as you all know, the Fast Track's Fast Tracks program was approved by the voters in 2004. As part of that approval, ballot measure approval for RTD, there was a financial plan associated with that was approved by many, bond counsel, et cetera, that led up to that. Within that Fast Tracks financial plan, as I mentioned, Fast Tracks money has to stay separate. The only exception is that in that initial Fast Tracks plan, it was agreed that Fast Tracks would pay or reimburse or pay the base system for any additional bus feeder service or paratransit service that was contemplated by adding new rail lines. So it's essentially Fast Track service, but because it's provided by the base system to service the Fast Tracks elements, it was determined to be a Fast Tracks cost. Therefore, Fast Tracks must pay base for that. In the FISA, this initial Fast Tracks plan, so the original assumption was that there would be a 1% growth in the revenue hours of that bus feeder service and paratransit service that's being subsidized or paid for by Fast Tracks. A 1% growth in the revenue hours year over year based on mainly on population growth. So in 2012, as you can imagine, there was a lot of discussion, a lot of public discussion about RTD's inability to identify enough funding to complete the rest of the Fast Tracks elements. So there was a lot of discussion, a lot of pressure, a lot of back and forth about trying to identify funding to finish additional Fast Tracks elements. The result was that the board at the time established the Fast Tracks internal savings account. That Fast Tracks internal savings account identified specific line items that were potential revenue sources to put into a fund, the FISA fund, and keep building that until enough money was available to build additional Fast Tracks items. So the primary source, and I'll show you what this looks like here in the next slide, but the primary source of that funding is approximately 22 million per year, and it's associated with that 1% annual growth. So the original Fast Tracks plan said 1%, not dollar growth, but revenue hours growth, and then the dollars were applied to that. So it was at the time shown that the actual revenue hours, these are service hours that our revenue vehicles are in service, those revenue hours were remaining flat, but yet the plan was calling for 1% growth that Fast Tracks would pay to that. As it was identified, would pay to the base system, as it was identified that the reality was less than the initial assumptions, that was identified as a source to say that instead of doing 1% revenue hour growth, let's only have Fast Tracks pay the base year-over-year increases according to CPI, inflation, knowing that those revenues, so it's volume versus amount, essentially. So we changed from a volume calculation per board direction down to a percentage increase based on inflation. The difference between those two is approximately $22 million per year. That $22 million per year, instead of going to the base system to pay for bus service that's not necessarily happening, stays in the FISA. And I would point out, I'm going to show you a condensed version of the FISA and explain, just kind of quickly walk through that. But we do include a FISA statement in the monthly financial status report and have for a long time. So it is available for public inspection. I'd be happy to discuss further with anybody that would like to. So this is what the FISA statement looks like in the monthly financial statements. It's got more columns in the actual statement showing more years, but just for presentation purposes, you can see, and I'll start at the bottom and go back up to the top and work my way down. What you can see is the Fast Tracks internal savings account balance at the very bottom. In the 2024 column, there's the 190,099,000. That's the balance that will reside in that account at the end of this year. Starting at the very top, that limit Fast Tracks funding increases for bus and paratransit to CPI. That's at approximate $22 million per year. It grows over each year because of inflation. But because we're not having Fast Tracks pay base as much as what was originally contemplated, that difference is 21,192,000 in 2024. That goes into the FISA. It stays with Fast Tracks. It doesn't get paid to base. Hitting on a few other items here. So many of these items were identified at the time of the creation of the FISA in around 2012, 2013. So some of these items were one-time things, such as Union Pacific Railroad. There was delays and it was decided to delay some work. That money was put into the FISA. Same with savings on project underrun. So as Fast Tracks was being built out, once that project was finished and closed out, if there was additional budget left over, it went into the FISA. This is all Fast Tracks money. So the option was, leave it in the FISA, the Fast Tracks unrestricted fund, or put it in the FISA so it's specifically identified for the purpose of the FISA, which is to finish additional Fast Tracks projects. Probably one of the only other really notable items in the top section is total sources of cash, is that any land sales or lease revenue that come into the agency, whether it's Fast Tracks or base system, goes into the FISA. And there wasn't room here, but there's footnotes within the monthly financial statements that show what that balance is made up of. It's been a few property sales, essentially. So you can see all the sources that have come in, and then right below sources is the actual funding uses that have been approved by the board through last many years. Additional money was used for additional scope items as for US 36 BRT for the Fast Tracks Flatiron Flyer, 6,129,000 for that. North Metro project draws additional scope work for the North Metro project. It was identified that that's a Fast Tracks project. Let's use FISA funding per the board. And then Northwest Peak Rail Service study of $8 million most recently, just a couple years ago, I believe it was, that $8 million was identified to be used from the FISA because it applies to future potential fast tracks expansion. One item, last time I'll point out on this is you can see out there it's shown in the column estimated 2025 through 2040. There's two large numbers there. They both have to do with commitments that RTD agreed to. So I'll start with the 60,746,000. That number is spread over 3 years, and it's really going to occur in 2025 through 2027. It has to do with the Denver Transit Partner project, the Eagle P3. Within the funding for that, it's contemplated over that 30-year term that there are certain points in time where additional funding will be paid to DTP for refurbishments and taking care of assets, because all the assets belong to RTD, but the Denver Transit Partners are concessionaires using those assets to provide service. The concessionaire agreement requires that those assets be returned to RTD at the end of the concessionaire agreement in a state of repair that would be expected for that point in their life. Along the way, there's additional spikes in payments occasionally to Denver Transit Partners for payments to do refurbishments and replacements of certain assets. So that's essentially what, this is debt service. It's kind of what we call our debt that we pay to, it's an obligation we pay to DTP. US 36 project draws same concept, I believe. I'm drawing a blank on that one, but it's the same concept. Those are out in the future. Those are fundings identified and agreed to through IGAs or concessionaire agreements that need to go out the door. So if you look at all the way through 2040, it's estimated that the balance in the FISA would be $525,333,000, barring any changes to this. So finishing up here, some of the challenges going forward. So I've shown you a very good financial position for RTD at this point in time, and how we've gotten there, some of the things we've done to get to that point. But there are some challenges as we talk about the 5-year financial forecast and going forward with the budget. There's certain things that we need to keep in mind as an agency. Number one being Tabor, a lot of discussion about that tonight, the impacts that Tabor may have on revenue limitations going forward should the Tabor debrucing expire. It will just expire, but should the ballot initiative be approved by the full board and go forward, depending on the outcome of that could have some impact to RTD's forward revenues. Revenue diversification, we've had lots of discussions how sales and use taxes make up 67 or so, about 2/3 of RTD's revenue portfolio. That's subject to volatility with or without impacts from Tabor. So we're reliant as an agency on one single revenue source that's not necessarily guaranteed. What we're seeing with tax collections is they're slowing. So I showed you the slide through March, and we're under budget. We're also trending lower than the prior year for the same period of time. If you go in with the April sales and use tax results, we're still seeing that flattening and decrease year over year in our sales and use tax results. And regarding Tabor, it probably couldn't come at a worse time if we're going to see a decrease, because that's going to be our new basis going forward if we're subject to Tabor in the future. Nonetheless, that's something to keep our eyes on as we project forward and decide what funding sources we're going to have and how they'll be used. So when I talked about the good financial position with all the fund balances, one of the biggest commitments that's not necessarily shown on our financial statements is maintaining our assets in a state of good repair. So when we bring the draft 5-year financial forecast, what you're going to see is, based on current thinking, much of those fund balances will be consumed by maintaining our assets in a state of good repair. Good example is the $150 million downtown rail reconstruction. That's a big chunk of money, and that will continue to happen as our infrastructure and our facilities age. So if you looked at our financial statements it looks like we have a lot of money, but it's essentially spoken for. We really need that to maintain what we have. So I would just offer that caution that it's, whether it's fast tracks or base system, a lot of that funding, unless we want to borrow additional money to pay for things, which creates its own problems, might be something that we should consider as an agency to keep intact and spend down for purposes of maintaining our system. I guess one kind of big unknown is inflation. What's going to happen with inflation? So what we've experienced is a lot of volatility in prices, goods and services. That certainly has an impact. So we make certain assumptions in our forecasts and our budgets, and then whether that holds true or not is up to the economy. And then staffing growth. I just wanted to put this one on here because our Human Resources Department and our Chief People Officer, Pelegi, is doing a fantastic job bringing people in. We must retain them. We're making a lot of progress, in my opinion. So that staffing growth is going to be very important as to how we ensure that we're staffing in the right areas and appropriate with the appropriate skill levels in coordination with our system optimization plan. So every time we staff frontline people, there's also associated support people. So we're really taking a closer look as we go forward in our budgeting and building everything around the staffing necessary to support system optimization plan. So, Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation for the Q1 financial update, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. And I truly appreciate the fact that you've said several times that all of these data are available to the public. They're on our website. They are easily accessible, and we are in the process of updating our performance dashboard to have even simpler, more easily understood representations of all of this information in that context. So we appreciate that. Madam First Vice Chair Catlin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Doug, thank you for that very good presentation. I appreciate it. And also your explanation of the FISA. But help me understand why in this current inflationary environment that we've had, why the FISA contribution remains almost at $22 million for the year. I just don't understand that. Can you help clarify that for me?
Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for the question, Director Catlin. Yes, so the inflation does impact that because we are increasing it year over year by the inflation rate. So it does increase the amount. So if you were to compare the prior year, I believe was 20 million, 19 point something million, now going up to 21 million in 2024. So that increase is based on inflation. So it does impact that. At the same time, it kind of decreases the amount that was originally contemplated. Well, the amount that was originally contemplated stays flat, right? The 1% growth is just compounded, and then inflation goes up, so it kind of squeezes the amount that goes to the FISA because it's that difference. If the FISA was never put in place, the Fast Tracks would be paying. Fast Tracks currently pays about the same amount to the base system of $20 million. It just so happens coincidentally that the amount that's retained for that difference is 20 million. So if the FISA was never put in place in this decrease to CPI versus the 1% revenue service growth wasn't put in place, Fast Tracks would actually be paying, instead of $20 million, they'd be paying about $40 million to base for this service. Right. So it does have a somewhat of an impact. It's relatively small, even at 5-6% inflation on $20 million, but certainly does come into play.
Thank you. If I might, Mr. Chair.
Please proceed.
Follow-up question. Well, also, I think one of our risks would be the Tabor question that we may suggest go on the ballot this November would really only impact the base system. Is that that's my assumption. But then following that, this board has the auspice or the authority to pause a FISA contribution, does it not? I mean, it was a previous board that decided that. It wasn't part of the 2004 fast track selection. So that could be something in our hip pocket to offset something, hypothetical risk should the Tabor extension not pass. Just
Mr. Chair.
Yes,
Thank
Mr. Cloud, please respond.
Thank you. Yeah, great questions. Yes, I'm drawing a blank, Director Callan. Please help me with the first part of the question.
The first part was the risk associated with the possibility or hypothetical thing that this Tabor extension would not pass. That's the risk to the Bay system solely. And so the second part was the board's authority to deal with the FISA on an annual basis.
Correct.
Thank you. So yes, regarding the Tabor applicable revenues, so we've talked a little bit about the voter authority. 1999 extended the Bay system debrucing exemption from Tabor through the end of no later than 2026 when the debt is paid off. So it happens that the debt will actually be paid off in 2024, subjecting the Bay system certainly to Tabor. When in 2004, when the voters approved the fast tracks 4/10 and the borrowing capacity, et cetera, that ballot language is very specific only to the 4/10 that the fast tracks collects. So what's happening in the Tabor calculation is it's not only the base, it's all non-4/10 sales tax revenue on the fast track system side too. So it subjects fast tracks fair revenue, other investment income, other types of income that they may get. So that's how we get the 50% of all of RTD revenues after taking out it's all the base part of fast tracks, and then you subtract out the biggest one is federal grants to come to about 600 million subject. So yeah, it does affect fast tracks. By the way, the fast tracks ballot initiative in 2004 not only spoke to the 4/10 being debruced, it also has a sunsetting provision. So once the debt is paid off in 2050, currently scheduled, RTD may only retain enough of that 4/10 to continue to operate and maintain the fast track system. So there's a potential to sunset that 4/10, reduce the 4/10 that's collected in the future. Second question regarding the FISA, yes. The board certainly, it's all those fund balances are under the auspices of the board to decide what to do with that. Do nothing with it. You can change it completely. It's totally up to the board. It was just something that was set forth in 2012 at the time. So including the FISA, I think the only thing that we could not change is anything that was approved by the voters in 2004 as part of that financial plan. But within those parameters, you can certainly make changes. And again, the voters have not approved the FISA, for instance. That was a board construction. Same with all the fund balances. Totally up to this board what we do with that going forward.
Thank you. It was not clear to me until tonight that the revenues generated from the fast tracks were also subject to that Tabor calculation. So thank you for that. That's unfortunate, but thanks for the clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm done.
You're very welcome. But recognize as to your last comment there, that is still a quarter of a century away in terms of that sunsetting. I recognize for some of us, quarter of a century isn't that long ago or that far in the future, but it's something that we should at least note for the record. Other committee members or board directors who have questions for Mr. McLeod concerning this. Mr. Board Chair Davidson, you are recognized.
Thank you, Committee Chair Tisdale. Thank you, Mr. McLeod. Really helpful presentation, well put together and walked through. Thank you for doing that. I very much appreciate it. Just one quick comment to the point of the Tabor revenue. This was one of the importance of that ballot language, having retain and spend all revenues it receives, it being the agency, from whatever sources without regard to limitation. So we are considering the whole amount there. And then I just also, Mr. McLeod, shifting gears, had a question for you. You talked about the challenges and a little bit of softening in the sales tax revenues. And then also we're still in inflation, and and we have state of good repair, and there's really an intersection between all three of those that could align to be pretty tough. And I know we've got a disturbing trend, not just multi-industry, but industry specific, regarding a lot of projects going over budget across the country in transit right now, and in some cases pretty sizably, and even minimal, limited number of vendors and bidding and so forth. As I just think about those over budget projects, our system aging and being in a place of taking on state of good repair while we're coming out of a high inflationary period, and with some of those softening numbers, I guess just from a qualitative perspective, how much risk do you see here to our current 5-year financial plan? How much are you worrying about this issue and talking about this issue? And if you could just shed a little bit of light of what some of the dialogues are internally, especially as we look at the TAM and so forth. Just would love to know your sense of big risks, small risks, somewhere in the middle.
Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. A great question, and thank you for that. So what we're seeing internally is for all of our efforts, all of our projects, essentially, we do put together an internal cost estimate before we can issue a purchase requisition. So that's a precursor to that, right? To establish foundation for what RTD believes it's willing to pay. Then we get bids in. What we're seeing is internal cost estimates, or ICEs, that were put together not too long ago because of inflation and volatility of projects. They change rapidly. So something that was put together a year or two ago, we need to take a quick look at it, not just apply an inflation factor. There's all sorts of materials costs and things that need to be recontemplated. So that's one risk. Fortunately, for the most part, almost all contracts that RTD enters into, with the exception of work order contracts, are fixed price contracts. So as we go to a PR, we get an agreement, negotiate a contracted price with the vendor. That's the price that RTD's the not to exceed amount that you're familiar with hearing. That's the price that's agreed to. Things that are down the road is where the concern is what does that really look like? So the way we budget for things is we apply an estimated inflation rate. So we try to account for that in the future. Obviously, this is unusual, what we're experiencing in the last 2-3 years. So that's been very difficult, but that's definitely a challenge. It definitely affects what we can afford. And we're also seeing, we've had some experience with also some vendors that agreed to these fixed rate prices that are really having a lot of pressure on them because of inflation, because 2-3 years ago they agreed a 3-year plus 2 option year contract at a fixed rate. Well, wages and everything else is going up far faster than what they expected, so they're experiencing some difficulties too. So it's really across the board, and it's very difficult to estimate. Where in the past we'd estimate the typical 3% overall, and then certain different inflation rates for wages in certain categories. Fuel had a different inflation rate, but this is just a whole guessing game at this point. But I think we need to be prepared as an agency to err on the side of caution that these price increases and things are going to be just much more expensive than what we've seen in the past.
Thank you. And anything further from you, Board Chair Davidson? Thank you.
No, thank you both.
Mr. Committee Vice Chair Guzman, you are recognized, sir.
Mr. McLeod, you had made reference to the sales and use tax report for April not being quite available for this, but you did receive it. So I'm guessing, I'm just looking back at the previous board documents from March, and it shows about just under $71,000 in sales and use tax, which puts us below our budget. And you said it was trending lower. So are we mimicking at a lower rate, the 2023 trends, is that what we're looking at in terms of budget, or is it going to surpass that a little bit?
If the trend, sorry, Mr. Chair, may I?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, and what we're seeing on that trended basis. And as an example, so when CU Bleeds gave us the forecast in August of last year, they had estimated a certain amount of growth in our sales and use taxes at RTD. When they came back and gave us the March report, they had lowered that forecast going forward by a substantial amount, not anything super alarming, but the most recent forecast is saying they think that in 2023, based on that, at that point in time, that RTD sales and use taxes would grow approximately 3% from 2023 to 2024. What's actually happening through April, now that we have the results, is we're actually down 0.4%, so less than 1% from the prior year, but that same four months this year versus last, not only we're not seeing not 3% growth year over year, but we're seeing smaller decrease. Yeah. Okay. And it's not a large number. It's $1.2 million after 4 months, but just the trend is a little concerning, especially when we budgeted for a 3% increase. And trends usually continue unless it's some anomaly. So I would suspect that we're going to continue to see that trend in flattening and potentially reduction in sales and use taxes throughout 2024.
Mr. Chairman. Okay, I got the nod. I one more question. It doesn't need to be answered now, probably can't be. I know we're in the process of getting all of these numbers together, but as we go forward through the year, in preparation of planning out a budget for 2025, will you be bringing forward recommendations around some of these accounts and some of these funds that we have currently, specific to FISA, to follow up with Director Catlin's question about what are we putting in there? Should we continue to put more in there? I mean, I get that this is an update, which is great, but the updates lead to action. And so as a discussion matter, will this committee be seeing some recommended action or some recommended discussion items that lead to recommended actions about what to do with some of these funds from the agency side? Will we be collaborating with you on some of those going forward into this budget planning process for later in the year? That way it doesn't quite come as a surprise at the end of the year, but also because we want to be fully prepared and invested, knowledgeable and aware of what we need to do to mitigate any unexpected circumstances. I think my concern goes back to last year, learning about the CU Lead School program and their projections, and being concerned that we were looking at this in too rosy a manner, even though it was fairly conservative, and I will admit that. I'm still concerned that we looked too positively at what could potentially happen with our Colorado economy, and so I want to make sure that we're addressing that as we go forward, knowing that sales revenue and income of any kind is kind of building the plane as you're flying it. And so I want to make sure that since we do not do a midterm or a mid-year budget update any further, and that we do want to just have one good solid budget that's done really well, that we have all of our facts and figures in order to be able to present one for 2025 that is going to be in the SMART goal mind frame, achievable, relevant, and timely, but also very specific to what we know is going to be the truth about the economic situation we face.
Mr. McLeod.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Great question. Yes. The answer is yes. Last month, we began the discussion about the fiscal policy. We do have on the agenda for the July Finance and Planning Committee to come back and continue that discussion. Where we're going with that is some potential options for the board to consider to kind of maybe shore things up, particularly in light of Tabor impacts. Just to be prepared. We've always been relatively conservative. So where we have as an agency 3 months of operating reserves set aside, the Government Finance Officers Association recommends as a best practice 2 months. So we've gone a little bit beyond there to kind of set money aside. One of the things that we proposed potentially that we may be coming to the board with, we're come with fiscal policy for 2025 as a discussion item in July, then come back in September with a recommended action to approve that fiscal policy to help develop the budget. In the revenue diversification working group, we're discussing some potential protections, for lack of a better word, for the agency regarding Tabor, such as possibly setting aside an additional reserve as a recommendation for potential Tabor refunds. We could do other things like shore up, even increase the amount of operating reserve. All those things that we would recommend essentially would buy RTD time so that we can make adjustments going forward, and we don't have to, if we didn't have any fund balances and all of a sudden we ran into difficulties, the first thing that we would probably have to do is make operating expense cuts, and the biggest dollars there are service. So I don't want to suggest that we would do that. We have the funding to maintain things, but it's going to come at a cost too. So if we end up using some of those fund balances that are really probably be used for state of good repair, and we use it because our revenues fall and we burn through those reserves for other purposes. I just think we need to be very mindful and forward looking as to what impacts that have. And certainly that would be part of the discussion with the board, make some recommendations, get some feedback, what the board is comfortable with. And also when we put that together, that 5-year financial plan, I think it gives a really good picture of what the projected expenses are. So even though revenues are very difficult to it's building the airplane while you're flying it. It's very difficult to accurately predict those or any potential recessions out in the future. What we can get a really good view of is what expenditures, especially things that we have to do, like pay our debt, some of those items. But then we can talk about what adjustments can we make going forward. There's a lot of things we can do, a lot of levers we can pull in terms of being flexible going forward and adjusting to revenues. So that would be part of the discussion as well. So hopefully I answered the question.
All right.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. I want to make one quick comment, if that's okay, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please proceed.
One of the main issues that came out this last legislative season is that they want to see a board that is nimble, with an agency that is nimble and quickly able to do these things. And so my question and my ask about this is, although we do work at the speed of government, because that is what we, the board, are, we still have quite a bit of agility and the ability to move with both action from the board and the necessary work from the agency. And it requires both of us working together. And I want to point that out because it's difficult to understand when you're not sitting here having these conversations on a regular basis, understanding all of the complexity going on behind the scenes, to point at something as simple as a budget line item, one single piece, and not even understanding the entirety of that. So as we go forward, I thank you for all of your work, and your staff has done an incredible job, but I want to keep being able to be nimble and agile, which I think this board is quite good at when we have the information we need. But again, we as board members, and somebody said it earlier, I think it was Second Vice Chair Geisinger, that we need to be able to work within our constituencies and tell a better story as directors to what's going on. So when we have the knowledge from you about what's going on with our budget and our agency, we have the ability to then go out and tell that story publicly about what's happening with the folks that we represent in our communities, respective to what's going on with service and how we're trying to protect that and grow that, even if we are, trying to deal with how do we make it all work and what we're facing. So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. Good questions all. Any other committee members or directors who have questions for Mr. McLeod? All right. I will note one thing. If you refer back to packet page 68, which is slide number 14 in your presentation, and you don't need to pull it up, but I just say that for the sake of the record. It is important to remember that the board established the FISA, the Fast Tracks Internal Savings Account. It is a board creation. It was not created by the General Assembly of Colorado. But the General Assembly does not always recall that, viz. The fact that we had a bill passed that referenced how the board was to prioritize expenditures from FISA. So it is important to understand that getting that information out is beneficial. Thank you very much for all of that information. All right, ladies and gentlemen, the next two discussion items do not have an accompanying board report tonight. I'll pause so you can cheer. These are items that are enumerated in our committee work plan. And so it is incumbent upon us to address these items in our committee meeting tonight. Now, the first of these two items, which is the third discussion item, is an update on our draft budget framework. And then the last one is an update regarding ongoing conversations related to an RTD return on investment dashboard item. As your committee chair, I will be introducing both of these items now, providing you with an update and facilitating any subsequent discussion by the committee and the other directors present. So first, regarding the draft budget framework. In April, we received an update from CFO McLeod related to recommendations from our internal auditors as to how the RTD budget is presented for approval by this board. This item is back before us tonight so that I can share an update on that work. The chair is informed by our staff that the modified budget framework is not yet prepared. When we drafted the work plan back in February, we all reasonably believed that the staff would have adequate time by June to give us an outline for a revised budget framework. I am informed by staff that despite their best efforts, they're not yet in a position to present that information to us tonight as originally scheduled in our work plan. Now, please recall, and we've mentioned this several times in the past, when we drafted and approved our various committee work plans, we all agreed that these were going to be fluid and subject to modification as circumstances dictated. We see that need presented tonight. So rather than just striking the agenda item and pretending that it's not in our work plan, your chair and your vice chair instructed staff that we would raise the matter tonight in an open meeting and provide you with this information and give you the opportunity to ask questions or to make comments if you feel so inclined. This, like the opportunity I gave you before to leave, this is that opportunity. So I will ask, first of all, Mr. McLeod, is there anything that you would like to say at this time to supplement or annotate the comments by the chair?
No, thank you. You covered it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right. Any committee members or directors who would like to add anything relative to this third discussion item? Seeing none, we'll proceed to our final discussion item on this evening's agenda. And that relates to an update on the progress of the RTD return on investment dashboard elements and framework. Now, we have discussed this concept several times as a board over the past few months in this meeting and in other meetings. You will recall that at our retreat in February, we reviewed the fact that 5 years ago, 2019, our then general manager pulled together relevant information regarding how much sales and use tax revenue was derived from each county in the RTD, together with an estimate of what was the approximate cost of services provided to each county. This was an attempt to discern what might be called a return on investment for each county relative to the sales and use taxes that they paid, and to respond to complaints by some counties that they were not receiving what they considered their fair share. Now, whether or not that was a good or even a valid measure, it was our then general manager's best effort at responding to these complaints that we were all hearing. At the retreat, we discussed the ability and the advisability to update that ROI measure. We assigned it to the Finance Committee for further consideration and action. We discussed this again at last month's committee meeting. At that time, our general manager CEO raised a very valid concern that this committee was exploring the creation of what could fairly be called another performance dashboard item without going through the performance committee. That was a relevant and salient observation. Specifically, if we're going to design a performance metric, and certainly ROI is a classic performance metric, then it should be designed by the performance committee, which is charged with such matters. Therefore, your chair and your vice chair, both of whom sit on the performance committee, come before you tonight to respectfully suggest that this issue of an ROI metric should be removed from this committee's work plan and reassigned to the performance committee. Now, this was discussed by us in yesterday's performance committee meeting, and that committee, which is chaired by First Chair Catlin, is prepared to proceed in that manner. Your chair and your vice chair wanted to bring this before you tonight to seek your concurrence in this approach and to amend our committee's work plan accordingly. So we welcome your discussion now for anyone who would like to ask a question or make a comment relative to moving the ROI metric from the Finance and Planning Committee work plan to the Performance Committee work plan. Please indicate if you'd like to step in on this. Director Ruscia, you are recognized.
Thank you, sir. So I was present at the Performance Committee when this was brought up, and I didn't know if it would be helpful if you wanted to comment on how the ROI was somewhat already incorporated, just for the record. And then I also wanted to ask, just for clarification, could this committee make an informal recommendation to the Performance Committee as to what we would like to see, how we would measure ROI, or what we might want to see in a dashboard, just recognizing that our committees of record are supposed to be specialty committees, and we definitely spent time on this during the board retreat. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. As to the second question first, I don't know that it's productive for the committee to attempt to take a committee stance, but every committee member, and for that matter, every board member, is invited to participate in the Performance Committee meetings and they have the opportunity to speak. And I think recommendations and suggestions are appropriate and could be considered. And I'll recognize the Performance Committee Chair in just a moment. As to the first element of your question, how is this in some respects already incorporated? If you look at the performance dashboard, which is on the RTD board website, RTD website, I think you'll see a number of things that address some of the elements of that. I don't know that they address it specifically as it was originally crafted back in 2019, but I think that the Performance Committee is perfectly capable of addressing and synthesizing available data to produce useful information. That having been said, Performance Committee Chair Catlin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You already referenced the performance dashboard, and we, as the Performance Committee, are welcoming input and suggestions on KPIs or other metrics that you would like to see in that performance dashboard. So that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I take it that your comment might have superseded the observation that Second Vice Chair Geisinger was going to make?
That's correct.
All right, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Any further discussion relative to the removal of the ROI metric from this committee's work plan and assigning it over to the Performance Committee work plan? Hearing none, thank you all for letting me take the time to lay the table out on that one and give you some further background. And so let it be written, so let it be done. We turn now to other matters. Let me ask, are there any other matters that any committee member would like to address at this point in time? Seeing none, are there any other matters that any director who is not a member of the committee would like to address at this time? The chair will note for the sake of the record that you have received, while we've been in this meeting, an email from Board Executive Manager Kroll that was received by him from former RTD Director Natalie Menton. Former Director Menton actually showed up at Blake Street, assuming that she could speak at the meeting, not realizing that these meetings continue for a time to be held only virtually rather than in person. And for the sake of the record, I promised her, because I worked with her well for a number of years, that we would reference in this meeting that she had submitted an email which is in opposition to the Tabor election ballot issue on the at the election. And so you can look at her email at your convenience, and she may well be present at the board meeting on this matter, but I wanted to bring that to your attention. All right, I see no other matters being raised by any committee member or by a director. Therefore, let me point out that our next meeting date is scheduled for Tuesday, July 16, 2024. That meeting of the Finance and Planning Committee on the 16th of July will have us, pursuant to our work plan, potentially act on recommendations regarding the Build America bonds, as to which you heard a presentation earlier this evening, and the Zero Fare for Youth, and also relative to zero fares for National Vote Early Day and Election Day. So that's just a preview of some of the things that are coming up. Likewise, we are also set, pursuant to our work plan, to discuss our fiscal policy and our 5-year financial plan. We just like to give you some coming attractions so you know what's in store. Seeing no other discussion, I will now call this meeting adjourned as of 8:34 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thank you all very much for your participation, and we hope that you have a wonderful evening.